Hello, hello, hello. My name is Matthew Schertz, also known as Mateus. We're transmitting here from a very exciting studio in the city of São Paulo, Brazil. I will be the anchor for the Brazil channel. I'm a journalist, in case you're interested, specialized in science and sustainability. Today, our first discussion will address the adaptation of the Brazilian consumerist legislation to the OECD standards. You might not know, but Brazil has a long relationship with the OECD, and over the last few years, it has begun to harmonize its regulations to meet with the standards of the organization in order to become a full member. Our question is can this be a sustainable relationship? To address it, we have two exceptional guests, Juliana Oliveira Domingos, who is Consumers National Secretary at the Ministry of Justice. She's a professor of economic law and antitrust law at the University of São Paulo, and was a visiting scholar at Georgetown University. She also presides the National Committee of Consumers Defense and the National Anti-Piracy Committee. Joining her will be Henrique Leão, Head of Public Affairs at Proteste. Henrique has a PhD in philosophy from the University of São Paulo and a master's in history from the University of Campinas, and has held leadership positions in all sectors of the world: government, private sector, not-for-profit organizations, and academia. Guys, take it away.
Professor Dr. Juliana Domingues, thank you so much for being with us, taking part of the International Forum by Euroconsumers. We're very happy and very proud to have you here. As an international organization, we are very excited to keep track in your work, a friend of Senacom, our National Secretary for Consumers. You are taking the lead in fundamental issues for consumers and trying to put every actor on board. You have refunded the Brazilian National Consumers Defense Council, and you have a pro-competitive approach that pleases very much. So could you share with us what are your challenges, your plans for the next months, the next years?
So first of all, I would like to thank you for this fantastic opportunity to participate in such an important forum and showcase the latest consumer policy developments in our National Secretariat for Consumer Affairs that we call here Senacom. In 2020, the main challenge to Senacom, I think, and as to other national consumer authorities, has also been the pandemic. Since the beginning of the pandemic in March, many problems arose in Brazil, and we are facing several negative externalities that may transfer to our society the costs that should be internalized by producers and service providers. Of course, this picture only reinforces what I am saying to our consumer system. We must create bridges and promote an environment that can improve a good communication and protect consumer rights without eliminating competition and innovation. It was not easy to promote consumer protection during the coronavirus outbreak, which has imposed the difficult task to balance the maintenance of the contracts in this scenario of potential loss of income due to the financial economic crisis caused by the pandemic. I think, as we all know, the challenges posed by coronavirus connected consumer protection issues with also personal data protection and e-commerce. and we could observe the need to develop new tools to protect specifically vulnerable consumers. And we have some specific policies for consumers with disabilities. Besides, we are structuring the National Consumer Protection Board to harmonize consumer relations and reduce the legal uncertainty in Brazil. The Brazilian system is very complicated, as we have a country with continental dimensions with different regional approaches, and we have several consumer demands to deal with. Of course, in the months and years to come, I think that consumer protection policy here must be linked to the OECD best consumer policy-making practices. And as for the question, I have established some priorities for next months with my team. Thus, regarding the priority list, I would like to highlight some of them. Can I?
Of course, please share with us.
Okay. So we are working hard for the adhesion of Senacom to OECD Committee on Consumer Policy as a participating member, and we hope to incorporate all OECD recommendations on consumer protection. We also work in Brazil a lot to make the accession to the eConsumer.gov, an international platform where consumers can report transnational consumer frauds. Another important goal is the promotion of the Brazilian platform, consumidor.gov.br. Our platform is an essential tool that helped a lot the consumers during the pandemic. And we now have a net version for mobile devices here in Brazil. And the Brazilian reality is very unusual. We have this high level of judicialization, and it is a problem that has been highlighted in several research, especially some conducted by the National Council of Justice. My team told me that the official data shows an increase in the stock of the cases pending judgment, and it's also important to understand that consumer-related procedures account for more than 10% of the new lawsuits, according to the data provided by National Justice Council. We have more than 80 million lawsuits pending before the pandemic. To develop new strategies to deal with this scenario, Senacom hired a technical consultant who is sponsored by the United Nations contract. And as I mentioned before, we have also the National Consumer Defense Council working with this. We have a specific commission dealing with alternative dispute resolutions methods. So we must improve our ODR, consumidor.gov.br. It is a very important platform, but we are working on the development of alternative dispute resolution methods, including mediation, self-regulation, co-regulation, and I think it's so crucial to be open to these different instruments, which happens to be more effective than the Brazilian current judicial system. I think it is also important to mention that 2 months ago, we launched a new public policy to consumers with disabilities. We realized during the pandemic that we must working in some new tools because we have 13 million consumers with visual impairments according to the Brazilian Institute of Geographic and Statistics, and they were very affected by the pandemic. During the pandemic, we also realized that the modernization of the consumer service system, that we call here SAC, is necessary. We have grew around 66% during the pandemic due to the low quality of the service provided. And we know that in the beginning it was very difficult to be able to access the call centers, specifically because since many of them were closed, but after 18 months without any improvement, we need to create more efficient channels in solving consuming demands. I think this topic is currently being discussed in a technical commission, which is part of the National Consumer Defense Council, and we will have this discussion with consumer protection agencies, regulatory agency, We have trade associations and even people with disabilities. They are also helping to discuss the best tools that we must develop, and we have a very big space to bring suggestions and opinions. I know that we will follow the other questions, but I must share with you that we are also improving tools to empower the Brazilian consumers, offering virtual programs on financial education. We have focused on promoting financial education and fighting abusive and predatory practices that may target vulnerable people. And we have the National School for Consumer Protection inside Senacom, providing specific programs, and they are all online. So we have organized a great number of debates and events, workshops regarding financial education for consumers. And we are also promoting initiatives to fight piracy in the e-commerce. We have already 2 different guidelines with the addition of very important economic groups. We are working on recall policies. Recall is still one of our priorities in our agenda. So in the next months and years to come, I think that besides being very linked to OECD best consumer policy making practices, we still need to follow the technological developments which impact, of course, in all consumption relations, and machine learning, Internet of Things, big data, everything is we need to follow very close to develop our consumer policies. Just to finish, I would like to say that we are still facing a very challenging moment, and to fully address all these new challenges brought up by the pandemic, we need to speed up the new policies pace already underway. Besides, we are reinforcing a comprehensive and a more transversal analysis of the relations involving consumers, governments, and companies. And I think that at this moment, we must create much more bridges and promote an environment that can improve new tools to protect consumer rights, but without eliminating competition and innovation.
Thank you so much for the wonderful summary. You have touched so many important sensitive issues, alternative methods of dispute resolutions, tools for disabled people, e-commerce, the OECD factor, as we call it, so many things. Maybe we could explore a little bit more the OECD thing, since we are an organization which was born inside the OECD area. Proteste em Brasil is our only organization from the group outside the OECD. And we are very, very convinced that if Brazil becomes a full member of OECD, it's going to be a very added value for consumers. So you touched this point already. So briefly, do you see that we still have a regulatory gap to be filled in order to become a full member of OECD in terms of consumption relations, or we are close to become a full member?
Right. Yes, we have the so-called consumer protection acquis. Now, it is not only the 7 recommendations on the area to be approved, but it also involves a wide number of other transversal disciplines. We must implement a regulatory reform, and we are, of course, preparing our team to deal with regulatory impact analysis. It's very important. Policymakers in the consumer field must understand about data protection, competition policies, and all OECD documents involve these kind of issues, right? We could see it inside the toolkits, guides, and guidelines from OECD. And of course, here in Brazil, I think that we are moving fast towards the goal of becoming OECD effective consumer protection country. But however, it is still, everything is very recent for us, right? We cannot compare Brazil with the institutions and the countries that have over 20 years of participation at the OECD. And as we all know, Brazil started this process to become a member of OECD specifically in 2017. And from 2017 to today, there have been many achievements and challenges concerning our participation in OECD. In 2018, we formally adhered to 2 OECD recommendations, right? But this year, I think it was very important because in July, we adhered to the new recommendations on consumer product safety. And we are the only non-member country adherent to this recommendation. I think the implementation of this new recommendation is an absolute priority to the OECD in consumer protection for the next years. And it is also here in Brazil, right? So it's important to mention that Senacom started this movement. I think it is very important. And of course, this year we became a participant of the OECD CCP formally. It was recent, was in August of this year, and we are very pleased about it. But by the way, in this challenging year of 2020, Senacom has accomplished many significant milestones in the international arena, and I think OECD, in fact, is a priority for us, right? This is a very important year for us in Brazil. We celebrated the 30th anniversary of our Consumer Defense Code, and I think that we received a great gift, Senacom adhesion to the e-consumer cross-border platform after the fulfilling the adhesion requirements as a new participant of the CCP, the Committee on Consumer Policy from OECD. Once our adhesion is confirmed, we will be part fully from the OECD EQUIS on consumer protection. Then for 2021 and the following years, I think we will face a big challenge to implement not only the 7 OECD consumer protection recommendations, but it involves legislative, different policies, changes inside our body, and updates as well. I think an institutional reform will be improved to give more structure to Senacom. I believe that the next steps will increase also the visibility of our national consumer policy. And I'm very glad to be part of this moment in Brazil. And I believe that our team is prepared to face the challenges that we will face in the next year.
Fantastic. Last year, we were one of the Brazilian organizations invited by the OECD mission on telecommunications for an interview to share impressions. The interview was at our National Telecommunications Agency, Anatel, in a very Republican attitude, invited all the organizations. And in my interview, I tried to highlight not only problems when telecoms work for consumers, but also regulation problems that impede the companies to have a better deployment. For instance, some regulations like the antenna laws, the pulverization of regulation among the entities of the Brazilian state, the federal sphere, states, and municipalities, and how this is difficult for companies also to go deeper in the service to consumers because they have so many obligations and pulverization. But my question to you is, how do you see Senacom working together, Anatel and other regulatory agents, when a specific area involving consumers' relations is regulated by a national agency?
Right, it is a very good question. And yes, consumer protection and sectorial regulation, they are very connected, especially in the telecom sector. They are deeply related. And considering our participation on OECD, we need to review many legal and policy frameworks on different economic sectors. The same happens with the consumer protection economic framework. In 2019, Senacom participated in the first Going Digital project, for example. And we prepared a contribution, a very important one, for the Chapter 4 related to the document Enhancing Trust in the Digital Economy. for going digital Brazil 2020. And it is something that we must follow together. As for the question, I think that beside the internalization of the OECD full regulatory competition and data protection policies, and also consumer protection acquis, I mean, all the legal instruments, we believe that one important key is the work inside the National Consumer Defense Council, because we have Anatel inside the National Consumer Defense Council. And as I mentioned before, the council is the new public forum where different federal regulatory competition and consumer protection bodies, they are discussing different policies and policies intersections with interdisciplinary approach. And it includes, of course, regulatory and competition issues. Inside the council, we have other federative bodies as state PROCONs, that we have several in Brazil, and we have private sector representatives from consumer and business associations. They are also talking with the regulatory bodies, just like Anatel, and with Senacom. So I believe that the cooperation among the government instances is very important to ensure the consumer protection. And this is it is very important when you talk about a country with many overlapping institutions, as we have here in Brazil, right? With many shared competences and responsibilities. When I am talking about telecom, I am also talking about consumer problems related to telecom. And sometimes telecom and competition, they need to talk together too, because they have different policies. But we have common objectives, right? And we have specific goals from each body. Therefore, this dialogue is essential for any public policy to be successful. And the OECD Telecommunications and Broadcasting Peer Review report pointed out the need for a more strong and durable connection between Senacom and Anatel. And I believe the same could be said about other regulated markets such as civil aviation, health, pharmaceutical. In the case of regulatory markets, markets that are regulated in Brazil, cooperation is sometimes critical, as these markets may create difficulties for less specialized bodies that are not very familiar with the market. But sharing data and exchanging views, this can help us to solve and to develop better public policies. And we intend to take part in a more effective communication with other regulatory agencies. And we started it in 2019. I believe we have a great example now during the pandemic. We have relations with different bodies and regulated sectors to develop some agreements that we call in Brazil tax. And we have a very good example with Senacom and the Brazilian Airlines regarding the coronavirus pandemic. And we know that a successful policy requires from us a more comprehensive perspective, taking into consideration the needs of the consumers, but also the situation of the regulatory market, right? In the civil aviation sector, for example, we saw it this year. Now, the National Civil Aviation Agency provided very important information and data about the sector for us, and it aided my team to understand what was possible in the context and the best outcomes for consumers. But we are making some important efforts. We are very open to, dialogue, and I think civil society is also much more close with us now, especially because we have the council, and the National Consumer Defense Council is a body that can help us to have a better relation with the national telecommunications agents like Anatel, but we have others, right? And it's a specific commission that we have now, a specific commission inside the council that is exploring specifically the Brazilian regulatory system, and we are emphasizing the relationship between the agents and the consumers. We think we can build it together, and we are doing a very good work inside this commission that is represented by Anatel.
Thank you very much. It was a very good explanation. The Europeans assume they have a very complex framework with national regulations, plus the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Council. But when we explain to them the structure of Brazilian public policies and regulations, they are amazed at how complex it is and how difficult to navigate it is, especially doing those interministerial bridges, as you mentioned. So this is very important. So the National Data Protection Authority, of course, is very important, especially in the relationship with companies, with big companies. But we are very concerned with individuals, since the Brazilian law follows in many aspects the European law. Brazilians are very different consumers from the Europeans, maybe closer to the American consumers. So I would like to hear from you, how do you see the relationship between Senacom and the new National Data Protection Authority, taking into account the interests and rights of Brazilian consumers?
Right. Well, Senacom had already been dealing with data protection and privacy issue, as we have a consumer protection and defense department, right, that started to investigate several conducts involving personal data violations before the law, our consumer law. For instance, we find it recently a very important fashion company for using, for example, facial recognition technology without the consumer's consent, and it is also a consumer violation, right? So it is data protection, but it's also a consumer violation. Nonetheless, the legislation offers new protection against privacy violations, and it also creates further legal safeguard for consumers. I think it represents significant consumer rights progress, even though the law makes an agency that now will deal with this issue, right? The National Data Protection Agency is a space now that they will take care much more about the data protection, and we are taking care about consumers, but sometimes it involves data protection too. And it is clear that Senacom, we also play a key role in data protection concerning consumer-related matters. As such, in the foreseeable future, I think Senacom intends, of course, to cooperate with this new agency, and probably we will establish a cooperation, right, specifically to ensure consumer welfare. Although we have already a significant concern for consumers authorities worldwide and in OECD countries related to digital service, and we have now problems with social media. We have some different platforms with our information, and it's much more relevant to be very close to this new agency to give them support, because we have several investigations related to digital services as consumer safety and welfare on the internet. It is also a priority in these times. So we are thinking about drafting an agreement to formally cooperate with this new agency, considering that we have some overlaps and that our consumer code also protects consumer data. And I think we will have space, right, to develop some public policies together. I am very happy to have now the National Data Protection Agency, because we just can go further investigations that are related to consumer problems. And we will probably give support in this beginning, considering these cases that we have at Senacon. And I think that these agents must be involved in all the public policy discussions that we have when we think about the problems worldwide.
Thank you, Professor Juliana. Representing Proteste, I would say that Brazilian consumers are very fortunate to have such a brilliant lawyer, jurist, teacher like you as our consumer protection first officer. And we want to support your work. So my last question for you is if you foresee any kind of collaboration between an international consumers protection organization like ours and your important work. If you foresee, we will be very happy to support. But I let you say it, if you see some sort of possible collaboration.
Of course. So first, thank you. I just love when they call me professor, because it is something that I am. But of course, I think consumer protection organizations play a crucial role in bringing information and promoting consumer rights in a very democratic and accessible way. As it is the tradition of our federal public administration, Senacon always promotes transparency and dialogue with all stakeholders. The profile of a more technical consumer association, just like Proteste, is essential to consumer protection in Brazil. You are doing a very important work in Brazil, and hopefully Senacon and Proteste have significant interaction, right? Proteste has space in our initiatives and public policies, and I hope to have you collaborating in this new modern and international consumer protection agenda in Brazil. I am sure that we can do a lot together, and it's an honor for me to have this support from Proteste. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure for us to contribute with your important work, and it was more than a pleasure to have your brilliance here in our Euroconsumers Forum 2020. Thank you so much for taking part.
Thank you so much for this invitation.